and welcome to all students, faculty, and guests. This is a very special conversation and book presentation of Lázaro Lima's book, Being Brown, Sonia Sotomayor, and the Latino Question. And welcome also to our speaker, Lázaro, and thank you for writing such a enlightening and useful book. And I want to note that this event has been made possible with the collaboration of the Hofstra Cultural Center, the Center for Race, Culture, and Social Justice, and the Department of Global Studies and Geography. Welcome, Lázaro. I want to introduce you before I give you the word. Lázaro Lima is a professor of Latino Studies in the Department of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies at Hunter College, CUNY. He's also an accomplished scholar and documentary filmmaker. His books include the one we are discussing today, Being Brown, Sonia Sotomayor, and the Latino Question, but he is also a co-author with Felice Picano of Ambientes, New Queer Latino Writing, and also another book called The Latino Body, Crisis Identities in American Literary and Cultural Memory. Now, he is the executive producer and co-writer of two documentary films, Las Mujeres, Latina Lives, American Dreams, and Ruby, a DACA dreamer in Trump's America. He has received many grants and awards from the likes of the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the American Library Association, and many other institutions. And his latest film, Ruby, a DACA dreamer in Trump's America, recently appeared on PBS and was awarded a BEA On-Location Documentary Award of Excellence. So it is a great honor and pleasure to have Professor Lázaro Lima with us today. Welcome, Lázaro.
Thanks so much, Zilkia, for the introduction. And I really do want to thank all the organizers. And let me just begin by saying that this is not normal. What we're going through right now is not normal. The mode of delivery is not normal. And it takes a special type of resilience to survive this particular moment. So seeing all these amazing students visiting, and I know that some of them might have been coerced into joining because they're related to classes, but you are precisely the population that I want to reach because this is your future that I hope I get a chance to talk about, and its relationship to what I'm here calling the democratic commons. You know, that's that messy space of contestation and social and political reflection where this project called democracy happens, where we come together and form a series of conversations, sometimes fights about what is meaningful and what should be meaningful for us moving forward. So you're precisely the population that I want to reach. And I want to thank Zilkia, Brenda, and Benita, and everybody else involved for the invitation. I'm really excited to learn from the students as well and their conversations that they might want to engage in. So thanks.
Very well. So just to give us an overall map of what we're going to be doing today, we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to be asking him a number of questions and he's going to answer them. We know that many of you have read part of the book already, which is great. And then towards the end, of course, we will have the opportunity of doing questions and answers from the audience. And there are three sections of this discussion. We will begin with a few useful concepts before we move to a second part in which we discuss his take on Sonia Sotomayor's trajectory, and a final session regarding current challenges in the light of the Latino question today. And I want to start with a general framing or my general take on this wonderful book. And it is that during this recent inauguration of President Joe Biden, as a Puerto Rican, it was very hard for me not to feel proud while watching Justice Sonia Sotomayor swear in Vice President Kamala Harris, and even by listening to Jennifer Lopez sing This Land is Your Land. However, your book could be read as a sobering explanation of why such pride could be a trap. Am I right?
I think you're right. Part of the challenge in our political moment, as I've seen it, and I teach and write about this, is the conflation, the confusion that happens when you substitute symbolic inclusion for the real, more meaningful structural inclusion that would facilitate the opening of what I'm here calling the democratic commons. So we're at a particular moment where the politics of representation, important as they are sometimes serving as a stand-in for the actual enfranchisement that democratic practice demands. And that is understanding, for example, and like you, I was really excited to watch J-Lo. J-Lo's from my generation. So, you know, anytime that she's doing a riff and she's actually interpolating words in Spanish, I get really, it was emotional for me too, is what I'm saying. But isn't it interesting that in the nation, and when we talk about Latinos, and we're talking about over 60 million. So Latinos are the largest majority minority in the United States, surpassing even African Americans. Yet they're the most disenfranchised from circuits of power and political representation. So what I'm saying, Zilkia, is that we've had to depend on entertainers. We've had to depend on baseball players. We've had to depend on musicians to represent for us that which would give us a sense that the social mirror before us is actually including and inclusive. So what does it mean in a political moment where we have a potential stand-in as a symbol of actual inclusion rather than the laws that we need to have to make inclusion meaningful in more than just a symbolic way? So what I would like to share with students is representation is really important. It allows us to see ourselves reflected in the social mirror before us, and it gives us the possibility of imagining ourselves in circuits of power, in representational media. And that's why the curriculum is so important, and having a curriculum that reflects a diversity of US experiences. But that's quite different than the analytical methods and tools that you need to think critically about what inclusion does and for whom and under what conditions. So I've been fundamentally interested in understanding what are the conditions under which subaltern bodies, Black, brown people, Southeast Asians, can come into the democratic commons in a meaningful way beyond symbolic inclusion. So those are some of the motivations that I had about understanding and celebrating moments like the one that we saw with J-Lo, but also what does it mean that if we ask students to name 5 of the most influential political or historical Latino figures, many students, even at great institutions like Hofstra, would be hard pressed to identify names outside of entertainment and sports. So that's part of the dynamic that the book seeks to lay bare, how to make that distinction between symbolic inclusion and the actual instantiation of the possibility for voting, the possibility for being, the possibility for self-governance and self-determination. Because while public media tells us that Latinos are but a recent intrusion onto the national fold, out of that 60 million, approximately 64% of them can actually vote. So we have a truncated understanding of what Latino-ness means. And while I want to get to your other questions too, I just want to share with students that I'm making a distinction between Latino and Hispanic. So in terms of definitions, Latino refers to a person of Latin American ancestry in the United States. Hispanic, while we can trace Latino heritage via language, via culture, is something different and really refers to the Iberian Peninsula. So we're talking about Portugal, Spain, and the Principality of Andorra. Oftentimes, those two terms get conflated in the public sphere, but keep in mind that when we have a former president calling Mexican rapists and criminals, that can only happen because of the type of sanctioned discrimination against people of Latin American ancestry in the United States. So in other words, Spaniards aren't being discriminated against en masse. People from Portugal or Andorra aren't being discriminated against en masse. So those are some of the distinctions that I want to make about the term Latino and what it means when we use it in social science research and in cultural studies in particular. That distinction doesn't always gel well in the news media, but that's the operative distinction that we make as specialists, and I hope we get to talk as specialists about Latinos.
Thank you so much for clarifying that distinction, very important between Hispanic and Latino, and also for putting out there that distinction also between significant political inclusion and symbolic or cosmetic inclusion, which I think is very, very necessary today. And in your book, you also offer a critique of how the country has constructed Latinos as the forever foreigners, and how Latinos have intervened in American civic life. Why did you choose the genre of biography to tell this story?
Because Sonia Sotomayor is the best known and most influential political figure in the nation. So she becomes a figure through which the character and promise of American political life can be reinvigorated again for scores of nationals, especially those most disenfranchised who are looking for a figure through which they can identify and establish a meaningful connection to the broader body politic outside of sports and outside of the music industry, for example. And one of the things that often surprises students is this understanding that that Latinos are but a recent intrusion, but yet we have so many Spanish-sounding states: California, Nevada, Nuevo Mexico, Texas. And it isn't just coincidental that we have these states. And I oftentimes begin by showing students a map as a way to construct knowledge about Latinos in the United States. And if you bear with me, I'm going to try to do a screen share and see if it works out. And again, I'm doing this for students. And what I'd like students to consider is whether they recognize this map and what that map, how that map is different right now than what we're used to seeing. So let me do the play, see if you can see it fully. So this is a map of Mexico and the United States prior to 1848. And what you have in these territories, and I'm trying to move my cursor and it won't let me for some reason, but what we have in the territories in green are the states of California, Nevada, New Mexico. We have parts of Wyoming, Colorado, as well as Texas. So that cultural legacy that adheres to, pardon me, I'm trying to do the stop share. And if you could do it on your end, it would be great because my cursor's lost the function. Okay.
Yes, we're back.
Yeah, Althea, could you stop the screen share? Sorry about that. So my cursor is apparently frozen on occasion, so that will limit the slides that we see. But anyway, I wanted to share that with you to give you a sense of the notion that Latinos are coming into the geographic fold of the United States, and to have you think a little bit more critically about how the United States went into what we would consider previously Latino territories. So when I say Latino, I do it on purpose, and I don't say Mexican territories, because in the 19th century, that whole region was occupied not just by Mexicans, it was occupied by indigenous populations, it was occupied by, in cases, manumitted free Blacks, and it was also occupied by Latin Americans. So when we have for example, the presence of Chileans mining all through modern day California, that was a practice that was common during the period. The idea of these borders being stayed and solid was antithetical to inter-American interaction, whether it was cultural, historical, or what have you. So looking at it in this direction, we begin to see that that cultural legacy has been in this country for far longer than one could imagine. And that's also part of what I try to do in the classroom, which is to decolonize the curriculum. This notion, this inheritance that the curriculum oftentimes obviates and erases the participation of people of Latin American ancestry in the United States is significant. It happens in so many disciplinary boundaries. And part of that dynamic is breaking those conceptions so that we can move into a more equitable understanding of what American civic life actually is. So the biography is really a type of hook that allows me to bring in Sonia Sotomayor and her relationship to Puerto Rico, because after 1898, we know that Puerto Rico became part of the United States, and it has remained after Muñoz Marin as a free associated territory. So it is a region that is culturally autonomous, but isn't free in the traditional sense, even though Puerto Ricans can vote and are citizens, provided in terms of voting in federal elections, they have to be in the United States. So Zilkia, that's a long-winded way of saying that part of what makes Sotomayor so interesting to me is that she is the child of colonial dispossessions, and how she inserts herself within the American body politic necessarily entails erasing those colonial connections so that then she could filter in through this notion of the American dream of inclusion, where if you work hard and you play by the rules, you can make it. And that's what the book attempted to address. It attempted to address that fiction.
Yeah, I think the biography is also what makes the book so useful, as I said in the beginning. But one of my favorite expressions from your book is how her biography reads like a collection of colonial hauntings, right? It's like the whole tragic history of Puerto Rico is inscribed in her life story. And I really like how you brought it in. In the spirit of discussing useful concepts, I also want to ask you about the one that is already, or two that are already in the title of the book. One of them is the Latino question itself. What is the Latino question, and how does it echo Du Bois' formulation of the Negro problem?
This is the moment in the presentation where I would seamlessly show you another slide, and I would talk about the slides, but I won't for fear of losing the ability to use my cursor. So the Latino question is this: what is the country to do with Latinos, and what are Latinos to do about their disenfranchisement from American civic life? That is, as the country's largest majority minority, how is it that they can find pockets of political emergence, that is, coming into being in the demos, in the democratic commons? And that question is intimately tied to Du Bois and his formulation of the Negro problem, which he posited in several of his essays, and it's in particular in The Talented 10th. And it's Black History Month, so we should celebrate the likes of Du Bois and his importance in allowing us to think through what race and racism does in a corrosive fashion to democratic institutions and practices. And his question was fundamentally about understanding why it is that whites continue to see the problem in terms of the Black body and not in relation to how the very conditions of possibility for the emergence of the United States as a geopolitical power entailed the enslavement of peoples. And he's interested in this because the US is the only geopolitical territory in history that has made slavery a permanent condition of being. Permanent as opposed to other societies where it is possible to be manumitted to be free. So he's interested in understanding how Blacks can imagine forms of freedom for themselves, but he sees that part of that happening necessarily entails not only re-educating the country, but also re-educating whites as to the very problem that they've created to begin with, that then turns onto a burden for Black and formerly enslaved Africans. So that's part of the relationship that I tried to establish here in bridging and having a conversation between brown intellectual projects and Black intellectual projects, and how working in tandem against anti-Black racism fortifies democratic practice and makes it meaningful in ways that we need to work through as a society, lest we inhabit this particular moment in history where alternative facts are the order of the day.
So following on that, how are you defining brownness, which is of course not an obvious thing? Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's the literal and lexical, right? What it might refer to, Latinos, but I'm defining brownness as a possibility for freedom. I'm defining brownness as a possibility for envisioning justice. I'm imagining brownness as a possibility to be free from the strictures that delimit human life by virtue of color. So I'm less interested in what philosophers would call an ontological identity. There's no such thing. And through your own work, Zilkia, I've learned how to best express that by simply saying that Latino identity is a type of fiction, but it is a necessary fiction. And that's part of what the demos, the democratic commons, requires. When people come together and coalesce around common goals, then they build on the possibility for representation, which is the hallmark of a democratic system, and the possibility to vote and so forth. So brownness is an idea that adheres into forms of freedom that we can imagine for ourselves and for those that might come after, by having an anchor in historical cause-effect relationships that allow us to say things and be in the world in ways that are historically and factually accurate. Hearing from our friends something, whatever they might feel about immigration, whatever they might feel about documented or undocumented Latin Americans, by touching history, if you will, by going to, for example, the map that I tried to show earlier, to show that the historical requires us to establish a context for our belief systems, and that is part of the democratic experiment. The democratic experiment is precisely about how education can free us from blind obedience and fealty to what was in the old world the monarchs, and what is emerging right now as fealty to a populist figure. So resorting to evidence is part of also what brownness is, because brownness is also not just a search for freedom, it's a possibility for historical accounting from which to make freedom happen from that basis.
If I remember correctly, in your book, you also associate brownness with invisibility, though.
How can you imagine freedom when you're invisible? And one of the ways, let me be precise, being politically invisible. So one of the ways to imagine it is precisely by coming together with Black and subaltern social actors to create what I think is one of the most and potentially useful engagements for youth culture and its relationship to the demos, to the democratic commons, which is the importance of BLM. The Black Lives Matter movement has instantiated a possibility for thinking through visibility in ways that go against the perceived notions that we've inherited about law being fundamentally colorblind. So one of the things that I mentioned in the book about this notion of invisibility is this conception that we have that ethnic studies scholar, they call it the ecumenical standard. Students, you don't need to write this down because I'll explain it simply. The ecumenical standard states that it doesn't matter whether you're Black, brown, white, male, female. If you get hit over the head with a baseball bat, it's going to hurt the same way. The problem, as that is instantiated in common practice, is that Black bodies and brown bodies bear the brunt of that metaphorical bat far more than other communities in the United States. So coming together around questions of justice and reparative justice in particular are central to this moment that's emerged where BLM is teaching us so many things about the possibility for full political enfranchisement as a search for freedom and as a type of perfectible democratic practice. So this is why I despair sometimes at the political condition, and especially because students are coming into cultural consciousness, historical consciousness, political consciousness. They're learning how to be in the world, and yet we don't have the vocabulary for understanding how those various components work. So that's why it's really important to make a distinction between symbolic inclusion and the real type of inclusion that would be meaningful for all of us as we fortify this thing called the democratic commons.
Thank you. I think we have gone full circle here with the concept. So this is the perfect time to begin talking more in detail about Sotomayor and why she is central to understanding the Latino question, and why is education so central to Sotomayor's story of accomplishment.
So as any student can attest, education is central to their lived experience because they want a job, they want an education. But we've had a running tension, a necessary running tension in the US from the 19th century onward between the civic case for education, and that civic case is we are quality thinkers, we can distinguish truth from fiction. We need an educated populace to actually be able to serve in a democracy, because without an educated populace, you're merely blinded by what appears to be truthful, and you need to distinguish between truth and fiction. So there's that civic case for education. And the other case, it's always the other hand, the other side of that coin, is the practical economic case. What can I get with a degree? So right now, the singular focus is, what can a degree do for me in this particular moment? And education is so central to Sonia Sotomayor's story because she is a child of affirmative action. And affirmative action emerges in 1964 after the Civil Rights Act and does some basic things. Like, for example, and we oftentimes don't talk about this when we talk about educational policy because we either forget it or it's inconvenient, which is women of any color or racial configuration weren't allowed at elite institutions up until after the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. For example, if you were a woman, wanted to go to Harvard, you couldn't go to Harvard. You had to go to Radcliffe College up until the early 70s. If you wanted to go to Columbia University, you couldn't go to Columbia University. You had to go to Barnard College. So one of the things that affirmative action did is it ensured that students have equal access to education through all the educational system, not just private system, but also public system. So Sonia Sotomayor arrives at Princeton, which was an all-male institution, and she arrives in 1972, just as Princeton is finally allowing women to attend the university. So she is a trailblazer in many respects, but she arrives, just like many women did, because of the Civil Rights Act, because there were laws, specific laws, and you can go to the book to find the specific laws that allowed that to happen, and I'm happy to share that with students in the Q&A if they have questions about it. And yet something happens between her arrival in 1972 at Princeton and the moment when she graduates from Yale Law School in 1979. In 1979, after she graduates from Yale, the United States is marked by a Supreme Court decision called Bakke versus the Regents of the University of California. And the Bakke case effectively eliminated quota-driven affirmative action through a particular case at their medical school at UC Davis, which out of 100 spots had saved approximately 10 to 15 spots for women and other disenfranchised minorities. That is, students that generally wouldn't have gone in. Admissions counselors were redirected to look more fully at their application and understand how a lack of equity in educational access prior to college or prior to medical school necessarily entailed using metrics that we weren't using. We were assuming that everybody had a chance at an equal education. Remember the ecumenical standard that I mentioned before about how if you get hit over the head with a baseball bat, it hurts the same way, whether you're male or female? Well, the same operative logic applied to school. If you went to public school or private school, you received the same education. So therefore, if you were hardworking, you should be able to get to these institutions. The practice was quite different. Think, for example, of, let's say, Fairfield County, Connecticut, and the Bronx in New York City. Think of the types of primary and secondary and high schools that are there, and the type of opportunities and opportunity hoarding that takes place in well-resourced places. And students don't often know this, but the best predictor of your success, of your life chances, for indices that we are familiar with, like income, longevity, retirement accounts, the ability to have credit, are related to the zip code where you come from. Zip codes still, to this moment, are the best predictor of your success. So I ask folks to consider, certainly in the book, I provide evidence, and I ask students to think about this right now. What does it mean that in a democracy, a zip code and how wealthy a school system is dictates your access to life indices that are qualitatively important, like making an income and being happy or having the possibility thereof. So the Bakke case really diminished and turned affirmative action to the managerial interest of the university. All of a sudden, after the Bakke case, when it wasn't legally mandated to have X amount of number, the so-called quota system that emerges, what happens is that all of a sudden institutions could say, well, if I hire a faculty member with a Spanish surname from Spain, I'm going to count them as Hispanic/Latino, and therefore that is diversity. That also means that administrators, and you may not know this, but if you don't opt in for indicating your race or ethnic identity when you apply for a job or when you go to an institution, administrators make that determination based on your surname. So you have to talk about symbolic inclusion. Mexican Americans have been traditionally discriminated from higher education. And we know that, the facts are there. And one of the ways that I've attempted to negotiate this conundrum is by understanding how, if Sonia Sotomayor is so successful, and she is, brilliant jurist, tremendous scholar, understands the law, applies it in ways that allow her to communicate with many constituencies, from so-called liberals to conservative. But those conditions of possibility existed because of affirmative action, because of a quota-driven affirmative action. So right now, when we tell students, hey, if you want to get to Harvard or Princeton, it's all about hard work, because otherwise, it's you and your merit. So what I want us to focus on is not necessarily individual merit, though that is incredibly important, but also the structural roadblocks to actual success that are delimited by structures of power that limit personal freedoms and these indices that I talked about possibilities for happiness and being in the world in a meaningful way. So what I'm sharing is that there is a certain track that we in higher ed are aware of, that we don't talk about very much, that has to do with the current economic case for education as opposed to the civic case. What I'm calling for is an understanding of education as a practice of freedom that requires necessarily freedom of thought and expression, but also the freedom to make a living and a living wage in a moment where it's become impossible to do so. And one last thing about your question about Sonia Sotomayor and education. After the 70s, and this happened in particular in California, under Ronald Reagan's second governorship, he instituted a 10% deduction in the education budget. By the time that he left office in California, and by the way, public education means that you have the state, through taxes, provide an education to a citizen. So that's that's part of the American experiment in democracy making. Again, what I mentioned in reference before as education is a practice of freedom, and that in a democracy, we need educated citizens to be able to effectuate that. So it goes from 10% in 1972, and by the time he leaves office in 1974, 32% of the UC budget has been cut. So public institutions then need to have donors give them more money to do the same services that they used to have before. CUNY, the system that I work for, it was a free system. So if you got into any of the excellent schools, you didn't have to pay. You paid some fees, nominal and otherwise. Another example, when I applied to graduate school, even at places like the University of Texas, they had fees for out-of-state students that were about $600 a month. Right now, UT Texas, all major land-grant institutions can no longer count on budget appropriations coming from taxes and public coffers. They come from private donations. So we're creating a tiered democracy where even the public system that existed to create free citizens who could think and not be led astray by either monarchs, in one case, as I mentioned before, or by populist figures, we no longer have that possibility. Students are graduating into a type of fiefdom where their life chances are limited by virtue of the debt that they're carrying. And yet, at a particular moment, when somebody like AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, wants to do away with student debt, it's seen by mostly conservative blogosphere as well as congressional figures as a return to socialism. It isn't socialism to support education for democratic purposes. It's socialism when your subsidies are such that the last major tax program coming out of the last administration made the top 1% 40 times wealthier than they had been before. That's socialism. Socialism is the last president relying on public monies to go into Bethesda Naval Hospital and have a treatment that allowed him to have his life saved because of COVID-19. So these are some of the disparities that we continue to perpetuate by believing that education is not a right. In democratic systems, it always has been. And it always has been because you need an educated citizenry, not just one that wants a job.
Very well put. I would say that again and again and again, like on a loop, until it sinks in, you know. You mentioned depth, and this is the topic of my next question, because a very intriguing part of your book is how you describe Sonia Sotomayor as being in a state of perpetual depth. Can you explain that, please?
One of the things that I was researching when it was first announced that she had been selected by Obama was I looked at the Senate Judiciary Committee filings. So the Senate has to list important information about their candidates. And as it turned out, Sotomayor was the most indebted Supreme Court nominee in the history of the country. That is, she was carrying more debt than any other previous associate justice had. So obviously there's a correlation between ethnic and racial ancestry, colonial status to PR, but I began to see broader patterns to beyond the obvious that she was in fact the most indebted. And that was, she was indebted to affirmative action for getting into Ivy League institutions. She was indebted to a hardworking single mother who sacrificed her life so that Sonia, through education, could achieve freedoms that she could have imagined. She was indebted to her hard work of Protestant work ethic that promised that if you follow the rules and you work hard, you can make it. Because in America, as President Obama said upon her nomination, anything is possible through hard work. And she was also indebted to the first Black president who was interested in symbolic representation because of pressure that he felt as the first Black president to do a nomination where it would actually reflect the population. So debt also as it relates to Puerto Rico, became fascinating to me because Puerto Rico is the most politically, social political space in the Americas to be the most indebted. I mean, Puerto Rico right now, especially after Hurricane Maria, is basically overseen through Promesa, which is an act that allows a fiscal governing board that's that you're not elected to, but you're rather named to, that allows to control finances on the island. And all the privatization that has happened on the island through neoliberal policies created the perfect storm where Puerto Rico is this biological and economic experimentation center. And I want to share with students, you're going to hear that term all the time, neoliberalism, in the human sciences. And here's a quick definition about neoliberalism. It proposes three things. It proposes economic cuts. It proposes personal responsibility, and it proposes austerity, which means privatization, that you privatize systems and institutions. So, for example, in Texas, what's happening in Texas and the failure of power plants and the power grid is a decision that was made in the 80s in Texas, that they wanted to deregulate government so that local municipalities could buy the least expensive power. And by doing so, you get rid of the corrective mechanisms to ensure that you have backup power, that you have systems to support clean water and infrastructure. And in a place like Texas that didn't have to contend with a global climate change quite the same way that it has as many other geopolitical spaces in the world, that has all of a sudden become a problem. So one of the challenges here is to understand how in becoming Puerto Ricans after 1917 with the Jones Act, which were folded into the United States, something else happened after 1917, which was a series of biological experiments on the island where corporations and pharmaceuticals from the United States were given free rein without having to pay local taxes. So in other words, the taxes that would go into infrastructure, roads, clean water, educational systems, left the island and went back stateside through these corporate and economic plans that created some of the worst, what I consider to be some of the worst atrocities in the 20th century, with regard to the sterilization of Puerto Rican women, with regard to the experiments, the clandestine contraceptive pill experiments that I talk about in the book in one of the chapters. And so part of why Sonia Sotomayor has to forget history is because history hurts so much that doing so would break the narrative of inclusion that symbolic inclusion makes you adhere to, which is if you work hard and you study, anything is possible here. So what's happened is that possibility for social mobility has been so truncated after the 70s in particular, and the instantiation of privatization, economic efficiency, and personal responsibility, which are the three pillars of neoliberalism. It's become then impossible to imagine anybody being anything other than indebted. So in that case, Puerto Rico is ostensibly indebted to the United States. Think of Trump throwing paper towels after Hurricane Maria and holding back all the FEMA funds that were earmarked for PR. He held them back. One of the first things that this current administration did is release aid that was associated via FEMA and various other programs for the infrastructure in Puerto Rico. So Puerto Rico requires an historical accounting, just like Sonia Sotomayor does. And this is also part of what I wanted to get to tell the story about how Sotomayor necessarily has to abide by the narratives of the bootstraps. You know, you pull yourself up by the bootstraps, that narrative that you need to help yourself or nobody else is going to help you. in order to make herself visible in American public life, because that's exactly what the Obama administration demanded, that she follow in the implantments of the American dream of inclusion and the American dream of social mobility. She had to create a narrative that would jibe with that in order for a seat at the table. And in robust democratic practice, that should be unimaginable. We wouldn't need to. But again, it is these fictions of inclusion that keep emerging, and we keep substituting inclusion proper with symbolic inclusion of the likes that I think Sonia Sotomayor represents, as well as former President Obama.
So further complexity in the Sotomayor story comes from the fact that she was both celebrated and criticized as a liberal, but in the book you consider evidence that before her arrival to the Supreme Court, she was in fact a conservative thinker. Will you talk about that?
One of the surprising things about the way that the blogosphere circulated images about Sonia Sotomayor was that it painted her as a liberal rather than a general centrist. And let me just give you some examples. She served on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Second Circuit from 1998 to 2009. And she ran through over 3,000 cases and wrote over 400 opinions. And all of them were aligned with conservative outcomes. For example, she denied the writ of habeas corpus to prisoners. And the writ of habeas corpus, if you're a prisoner and you want to demand a new trial, or you want to have your death penalty overturned, it is your writ of last resort. So one would expect that a liberal outcome would be one that grants the petition of a writ to habeas corpus, literally have you the body or bring me the body in Latin, and it's part of US legal code. In 92% of the cases, she denied the writ of habeas corpus for prisoners. She denied race claims in over 93% of the cases. Yet the only case that emerged that the extreme right harped on was a case from New Haven, Connecticut, dealing with a firefighter. And she was basically following stare decisis, which is established law, when she said in that particular case that this fireman, who was an Italian American, and his test for promotion was thrown out because the test was deemed to produce outcomes that limit the promotion of Black officers. She agreed with President. And so that became a symbolic shorthand for everybody to understand her so-called liberalism, when the reality at hand was that, for example, she had defended in Mineola on Long Island and in other areas of New York and Philadelphia, white supremacists. She had defended the right of white supremacists through First Amendment invocations to their freedom of speech, even though in one particular case in Long Island, they were sending paraphernalia that made typical jabs about Jews, about Blacks, and about brown people. So the evidence was there all along, but it was manipulated, and it circulated, and it was believed by virtue of whatever media sphere you pay attention to. And this is part of our new political moment. We are so saturated with confirmation bias and going in the direction of those systems that we agree with, that it becomes impossible to get at the real story, that is to parse truth from fiction, because we're now committed to single or singularly focused political ends rather than what's good for the democratic commons. So part of the Sotomayor story and part of her judicial thinking really begins to change when she lands in the Supreme Court. And that's where we see a transformation, and that she begins to use, for example, in a case called Mohawk Industries, she begins to use, for the very first time, the term undocumented immigrant, whereas before it had been illegal immigrant. So she instantiates, through the practice of law, categories of being in the world and humanity that don't align one's entire social identity with illegality, but rather with a condition that's premised on a relationship to the law. In other words, undocumented refers to an act, not a condition of being or an identity proper. And that's significant in law because it provides the basis then for other cases to emerge where you begin then to split those hairs and make those distinctions and then have a public consciousness and a reckoning happening after that case.
How do you explain that change in her thinking?
You know, I interviewed a lot of people for this project, and one of the folks that I interviewed, and it's a story that gets repeated on occasion for those of us who follow the Supreme Court and are interested in this. During her first year on the court, she was invited to Anton Scalia's Christmas party in Georgetown, Washington, D.C., which was typical. And he was a great music buff and would play Christmas carols. And he said point blank, "Sonia, why don't you pick a Christmas carol for us to sing?" And without missing a beat, as the story was told to me, she said, "Let's play Feliz Navidad by Jose Feliciano." And he looks at her, slams the piano, and says, "We don't play that kind of music here." And I think that may not have been the moment that transforms her judicial thinking, but she had played by the rules all her life. Part of the reason why she was a success story was because she followed outcomes that align with causes that go against what people would perceive her to be. So if she's Latina, she began her career by solidifying the fact that she wasn't going to privilege any political, social, ethnic, or racial identity. She continues that on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And when she gets to the court, she begins to see that this system, and again, this is part hypotheses, and if I'm asking students to rely on evidence, I need to provide evidence, and I don't have enough evidence other than anecdotes. But I do see a transformation after she arrives on the court, where she begins to see that the so-called ecumenical standard that I used before, that idea that law is colorblind and it's gender blind, she begins to realize how it isn't, especially in the context of a Supreme Court that is now the most radicalized extreme right Supreme Court in recent history, certainly within the last 100 years, where you have Supreme Court associate justices, the majority of them, appointed by the Federalist Society, which is one of the most conservative societies to emerge in law studies in, I believe it was 1982 at Harvard and the University of Chicago, where they had a long programmatic goal of having more conservative outcomes all through the judicial system, from the primary courts all the way up to the Supreme Court. So for the first time in the nation's history, this last administration relied on recommendations from the Federalist Society, then on the nominating committee, which would have been the standard practice that gets taken care of within the Senate. So right now she can't help but look like a liberal, because any centrist would, in comparison to this court, be so far appearing to the left that it would make the possibility moot. Again, it's symbolic. We've inherited an understanding right now of her as a liberal when we know vis-a-vis evidence that she wasn't when she arrived on the court. And this transformation that is happening, that would be similar to some of the jurisprudential writings of the Brennan Court, which in the 60s coincided with a political moment that recognized that women weren't being treated fairly, that Blacks weren't being treated fairly, and so forth. So it's this moment, weird moment, where we've arrived, where she begins to change because what she believed in, perhaps, no longer holds true. She sees how the court has been radicalized. She sees how we have an Amy Coney Barrett who is pro-life and against Roe v. Wade, where we have economic decisions that are being made by what are called originalist, and textualist. That is a particular orientation to understanding the Constitution. And that's what the Supreme Court does. It's a final arbiter of laws through the Constitution. So what's fascinating to me is she is now at a moment where she's confronting textualist and originalist interpretations that want to interpret the Constitution as the founding fathers did, which would mean people who actually owned slaves, that whatever they meant must continue to be what we believe in today, rather than a living document that should be revitalized for what the nation needs as guiding principles premised on law.
Yeah, and I want to now bring you back to the relevance of Sotomayor's story to our very, very current issues in this country, which you have begun to again bring back, because it's of course at the core of the whole thing. You described that the gutting of public education is the origin of today's alternative facts crisis. Like, would you explain and talk about that?
One of the historical, it seems like we're living every day a historical moment. And from the pandemic to malfeasance in government and the storming of the Capitol on July 6th, these are things that were years ago, a year ago in December, unimaginable. So we have a whole population, significant segments thereof, that are being driven by conspiracy theories and by alternative facts. And you might recall in the last administration when former President Trump was called to task on various policies regarding the Muslim ban, for example, and various other executive orders against LGBTQ communities and the transgender community in particular. His spokesperson, Kellyanne Conway, said, well, you're only seeing that because you're not looking at alternative facts. That is that if you, and those of us who work in literary studies know this distinction quite well. There's a difference between story and discourse. Story are the events as they happen from A to Z, the actual events. Discourse is the way you arrange those letters to produce a given effect. We used to call that propaganda. We used to call that lies. This last administration would call it alternative facts. That is, facts that fit their particular vision, and they have a whole political ecosystem that transmits that information through confirmation bias to people who actually want to hear that information and who truly believe it. And this is where we've reached a crisis in governance right now, where because political culture is now devoid of truth claims, we are now in a moment where we go, and this happens both on the left and the right. We don't go to a center, if there could possibly be one. We go to our own ecosystems. And that's part of the challenge at hand, where if we continue this way, we're going to have an even more frayed democracy. One of the just sad moments in US cultural history is recognizing that people would use the American flag against police officers, for example, defending the court, the people's house, by virtue of wanting to kill people, by virtue of wanting to get political dissidents, by wanting to hang, out of all people, former Vice President Mike Pence, and do a citizen's arrest on Nancy Pelosi and whoever was deemed, a so-called socialist liberal, like AOC, is the way that she's pegged as well. So we're at a moment right now where it is unimaginable, and it's very difficult for students who don't have a history of understanding relative stability on the court, in the Senate, where you have an actor that begins to break then the social norms that made the functioning of democracy possible, and you present alternative facts to get migrant children separated from their parents and literally put in cages. One of the things that I mentioned in the book, for example, is how one of the orphanages, one of the major ones, comes from the DeVos family. Betsy DeVos, the former director of the Education Department of the United States, has ties to Bethany Christian Services, which is an orphanage. And a lot of these orphans are now in Bethany Christian Services. And what other time in history has this happened? Slavery, when children were separated from their mothers and put into contingent situations where they were perpetually enslaved. So we're at a moment right now where we're so overgutted with information that the possibility of staying at a talk like this is almost impossible for this generation, because we're used to multitasking to such a degree that we can't focus on the object at hand. And this is why humanities and slow humanities immersion is really central to slowing down that process, not because we want to keep people from social media or Insta or whatever it is they want to be on, or video games, but because, again, democratic practice requires an informed citizenry. And you can't have that, and you don't know what you're going to lose if you don't have that moving forward. Those are some of the central challenges that I think is facing this generation in particular. And I'd really be happy now to just entertain questions from them or others in the audience.
Yes, please. I think it's the time for students to ask your questions. Yes, Sophie.
Hi. Okay. So I've been taking notes, and so the question that I came up with, this is in regards to you were talking about how she only kind of rose to power by going against the grain and doing the opposite of what people expected from her, like Professor Janer's question about her being conservative until she like rose up to like a high enough rank. And so my question is, if she, and this applies to both Sotomayor and like anybody who got to a certain level of prominence within the government or just in general, if she only rose to power by doing the opposite of what people expected of her, by doing things that one may consider harmful to her own community, such as having sort of colorblind opinions, like you said, not advocating for, but using the First Amendment to sort of defend the opinions of like white supremacists, of originally using language such as like illegal instead of undocumented, so like things that you could say are harmful to her own community. Can we even count it as symbolic inclusion, or is it simply a betrayal? Because if you only rise to power sort of on the backs of your own people, is it even symbolic? Because you're causing harm on your way up only to change your opinions once you're at the top.
Thanks for that question, Sophie. I really appreciate it. Part of Sotomayor's success is she did actually exactly what was expected of her. That is, to follow a particular view and way of being in the world that allowed her to be valedictorian at Princeton, that allowed her to go to a top law school. And it isn't until her arrival at law school that she begins to realize that this version of the law that she's inherited from years of watching Perry Mason and reading Nancy Drew mysteries, all of a sudden is incommensurate with the privilege that she begins to see around her. And there's also a distinction about whether we could attribute her self-fashioning as conscience or not. Her self-fashioning is much like our own in our classrooms and our jobs. We do what's expected and we excel and we do it in a particular way. And I'm really not convinced that Sotomayor, who, by the way, petitioned while at Princeton to bring the first tenured brown professor to the university, who ended up in the Spanish department, Spanish and Portuguese department, and his name is Arcadio Diaz Quiñones, an incredible Puerto Rican intellectual. He arrives tenured from the University of Puerto Rico because she, with students from what used to be called the Third World Center, petitioned by virtue of starting a lawsuit against the Department of Education and saying, how is it possible that in an equitable system, there is no tenured professor who happens to be brown? So it's fascinating that she both worked within the system, but also within the strictures of the law and the rules. In other words, so she, I don't think would imagine herself an activist at all under these conditions. And it becomes really difficult for us to know her intent. And I think we need to give her some slack in that regard, because one of the things that I don't want it to be a takeaway is that she is trampling on others. Rather, she is working with the limited conditions of possibility that she's inherited to actually do the type of jurisprudential work that she understands as meaningful within a democratic system. So all the things that I mentioned about PR, she wasn't born in PR, she was born in the Bronx, right? So she wouldn't, for example, necessarily know about the contraceptive pill trials. She wouldn't necessarily know while she was in college about the tax incentives that went in 1917 to the island. So it's fascinating how she is developing also as an intellectual and a jurisprudential intellectual, which to me is really a healthy sign to go from one way and then seeing different evidence that leads you in a different direction, rather than a consistent textualist or originalist interpretation of the law, which is what we really see in at least 6 of the 9 on the Supreme Court currently. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you, Sophia, and thank you, Lázaro. Just a reminder for students to please use the raise hand icon so we can get to see you and you get to the top. So we had Brittany. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, so I've begun reading the book Being Brown. I think it's very interesting and informative and has a lot of great perspectives to it. One question I have is that I know you talked earlier about like the power in education and education as a tool and being very important. And the book, I noticed, uses a type of jargon, type of vocabulary and language that's targeted towards people who are educated, like people in this room who have been to college and have read professional research papers that use a certain kind of professional language. But I noticed that the language isn't as accessible to those who don't have a higher level of education, but could also benefit from this information. So I'm just wondering the reasoning behind your decision to create a book in a type of way that appeals to those with more education versus writing it for an audience that isn't as educated already.
Brittany, that's really an excellent point that you make about reframing it in such a way, and if I may, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're asking is, in a book that seeks to be inclusive, why is the language so calculated to exclude? That might be one of the ways of reframing it. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is effectuate change within the spheres of influence that I'm familiar with, and the academy happens to be one of them, because much the same way that we as intelligent people may not know the inner workings of a car engine and what a carburetor is, and we rely on mechanics to figure it out for us, unless we have the precise vocabulary for understanding this problematic that I've been sharing with you today, we're going to be impoverished, and we're going to focus solely on how we feel in relation to what's happening or what we're understanding. So my invocation is for young, brilliant people such as yourself, and I can tell by the way you're framing that question that you are, that then you take this to your own communities, that you take it to your friends, to those conversations that are happening now virtually and that once again will soon be happening, God willing, if happening in person, because it's only then when we bridge different constituencies that we begin to really form a robust democratic commons. My mother didn't have anything other than a 6th grade education, and she was one of the most intelligent people that I've ever met. And I mean that not just because she's my mom's, but because she had an ethical core and knew how to ask the right types of questions. And had she had the vocabulary, had she had the language at a particular moment, her life possibilities for fulfillment might have been different. So I want to work in tandem with the likes of you and brilliant students such as yourself, so that we could figure out how we could have teach-ins, how we could have conversations that are robust, but that don't solely rely on what I've been calling symbolic representation. In other words, I want us to be able to identify historically and with evidence why we have been shortchanged in the current democratic order, especially after the 70s and 80s in the United States when neoliberal policies emerged. And sadly, when I take my car to the mechanic, they can charge me whatever they want because I have no idea what they're telling them. I have to rely. I don't want to, as a cultural historian, to only appeal to a particular segment that might understand my family, for example, those, especially the elder ones who haven't had an opportunity to go to college. I want to have those conversations with them when we are also having conversations with my family's younger children who are in college and are able to exercise that fundamental practice of freedom, which is freedom from dogma and freedom from being intellectually enslaved to the ideas of others rather than our own. So I hope you take that, Brittany, as an invitation to share information in the classes that you're taking that aren't necessarily easy. We want easy right now. We want an easy fix to absolutely everything. But we know through experience that that easy fix is going to be short-lived, if at all, unless we fortify practices that are going to require for us to have the formidable vocabulary to understand that, for example, white nationalism isn't necessarily about white people. It's about structures of power that give access to certain people who think and behave a certain way that allows them to be politically and culturally enfranchised. And it's certainly racism too, but this is part of the challenge at hand, how to have those conversations in meaningful ways, and also how to trust your intelligence and how to communicate that. So, and I promise you I'm going to do in my next project a better job at communicating in language that's less calculated to exclude. I mean that.
Or maybe a documentary. I can see the documentary with the turning point in Sonia Sotomayor's thinking at that Christmas party. I can see it as you explain it. Let's hear Jan.
Yes, thank you for taking my question. Reading a little bit about being brown, I wanted to ask, in the instance of this pandemic that we're going through and things of that nature, do you think that this sort of struggle or this sort of outward struggle for the world is something that exacerbates the cultural disenfranchisement of Latin Americans and other minorities in the grand scheme of how we all react to sort of worldwide phenomenons? And do you think that it exacerbates, or do you think that it sort of destabilizes everything to the point where it highlights the existing structural instabilities in white nationalism and some of the topics that you had mentioned?
John, all of you are asking really solid, important questions. Did somebody put you up to this? You know, are you are you getting extra class credit for doing this stuff? Let me invoke what I suggested we use, which is evidence and not mere speculation. So here's some evidence. At the onset of the pandemic in early March of last year, the communities most affected in New York City were first brown people, Latinos, Latin American immigrants, documented or not, and Blacks. So talk about life chances and how a global pandemic has local effects. We can begin to extrapolate why it is that the pandemic had disparate impact on Black and brown communities. Why? Because they were doing the essential services that people in working in white collar jobs could, if they were lucky, work from home, as opposed to having to get on a bike to deliver food or to go to a restaurant that eventually remained at partial capacity and then they were closed, but then the kitchens were staffed for delivery, which was the only way that many could survive. Think of schools that are more like jails, where you have to walk through metal detectors rather to be able to get in and have poor circulation. Those are all clustered around communities like Elmhurst, like Corona, New York City, that aren't just Black and brown communities, but they're also Southeast Asian. They're also Nigerian immigrants to the United States. But the evidence, and I've written about this and it's online somewhere, is that New York then became a template for the rest of the country, because we saw it happening in Chicago, we saw it happening in Los Angeles, that it is the most underserved communities that are the most vulnerable. And this is where we get to the crux of democratic practice. What is it that we allow a system called democracy that creates a tiered democracy where certain bodies become an exchangeable commodity under capital, where certain bodies could be used and thrown away? One of the two most harrowing images from that moment that we lived through, and boy, did we live through it, were the trucks, the refrigerated trucks that appeared as a makeshift morgue in Elmhurst Hospital and Hart Island, where you had coffins, you had pine coffins being piled on top of each other, burying the dead, some without any knowledge of who their first of kin was, if they were found in the street, if they were found in their apartments. So we went through a lot. And I don't want us to forget, speaking of accounting, those bodies that were most vulnerable and why it happened, and why these bodies continue to be an exchangeable commodity under capital. It isn't possible in a democratic system to have such a blatant disparate impact based on race and ethnicity and working class status. So thank you for that question.
Let's hear from Abigail.
So one thing also about, I guess, the changes, that there have been some changes in how Justice Sotomayor has articulated policies. I was wondering if you have any observations about the way that politicians' policies and their political orientations may change when they become Supreme Court justices, seeing as that is a life position. I've wondered that myself about if you attain like this kind of life position of being empowered, does that impact the way that you go on to articulate policies, like going forward?
Yep. Another great question, Abigail. Ostensibly, in the Supreme Court, you don't make policy. You interpret the letter and law of the Constitution. And that's why interpreting, what we do in the language classroom, what we do in the literature classroom, what we do in the interpretive humanities is really central to this, because the veneer of impartiality goes back, at least in the United States, to the Bork hearings, where he was, Bork, who had been nominated to the Supreme Court in the 90s, didn't become flustered at all when he was asked very direct questions. And so he didn't get nominated to the Supreme Court. And after that, all presidents have prepared potential nominees to appear as if they are umpires, if they're only calling the shots and interpreting based on the concept of stare decisis. That is, what came before should be left done and not be undone, rather. So even though they are, in fact, in a way, serving as political bellwethers for the historical moment, they also have to perform as if they are not doing policy, but only doing the interpretation of the law. But here's the cincher. Interpreting law in a particular way has an implication for policy. Think of the transgender ban in the military and the directives that meant that you wouldn't bring any more transgender folks into the military after Trump initiated this. So there was an actual hold. So that affected people's ability to get promoted, people's ability to understand if they're going to have the life that they had known. So it's stunning how it has implications for policy that others take care of in its actual implementation. But in terms of the way that they understand themselves fundamentally as umpires. But again, I raise the caveat that they all have an interpretive frame. And to have an originalist, that's actually a position, an interpretive position, an originalist or a textualist, which is really a sister of originalist thinking, that you actually go back to the meaning the word had when the Constitution was written, and not meanings that the words would have right now. So imagine people perpetuating a version of the law based on the writings of slaveholders. So that's, how could that not be political is a logical question. But they can't appear, for example, when I requested to interview her, and I have met her on several occasions, and I've talked to her about many things. She came to my former university. We invited her to the law school. Fantastic presentation that she gave. But her office and the office of any Supreme Court justice won't allow for that type of interview because they don't want to make it appear that the version of the story that I'm telling, that I'm espousing, coincides with their political proclivities. So in other words, if I painted her to be a liberal, she wouldn't want that. So she'll do plenty of interviews for books that she's written, including her memoir, My Beloved World, and I hope you get a chance to read it. It's an important book, as well as some of her children's stories. But she's acting as an umpire. That's what she will say. And in fact, if she didn't act like an umpire, her power would be severely diminished by virtue of the potential attacks that would have notable effects on her health and her well-being. And that could be said of any Supreme Court justice at all. So thanks for that, Abigail.
I think we have time for one more quick question, if anybody's still shy. Oh, I see a question in the chat. Sean, are you able to ask it yourself? Or I can read it if you want. I don't see you.
No, I can ask it.
Go ahead.
Basically, I heard in the beginning of the presentation that you were talking about like liberals and conservatives as sort of like so-called liberals or so-called conservatives. I remember you saying that towards like the beginning. And I was wondering what you meant by that.
Yeah, another attentive and thoughtful question. Let me give you an example, Sean, if I may. Part of the attack right now on higher education is premised on the idea that students are at liberal arts colleges because they're there to learn liberal ideology. So people literally believe that liberalism, which is a political philosophy about individual freedom, and that actually emerges in the United States as a way to counter prejudice and to be, and it comes from the Greco-Roman tradition. When we talk about the liberal arts, artes liberales in Latin, it generally means free of dogma and free of mental enslavement. So people needed to be educated, and one of the ways that you would do that is by taking a liberal arts education. Sciences, natural sciences, hard sciences, humanities, arts. It was believed that only then would you have an informed citizenry. Now, that is a political philosophy. It's not liberal like we meet it in the United States today. It's not, the so-called invective of the socialists like AOC, who promotes some ideas that are close to socialism, but if anybody knew the real meaning of socialism, they wouldn't be called a socialist at all. So my putting those terms in quotes is because public understandings of both liberal and conservative are fluctuating and generally largely erroneous. Let me give you an example on the conservative end. Conservatism is also a political ideology that espouses freedom from government oppression, taxation that is in measure with individualism and hardy American ideals like economic freedom and prosperity. That type of conservatism no longer exists. The bellwether for conservatism in the United States have been journals, for example, like the National Review. And when you have its former editor, George Will of the National Review, say that conservatism doesn't exist anymore, that's precisely what he's getting at. We're now associating conservatism with cruel treatment of populations, be they nationals who happen to be citizens, but we can poison their water because in neoliberalism, if you privatize and you get in the city in Michigan, in Lansing, Michigan, a company that doesn't protect the water, then who gets to suffer? A particular population that's largely marked by Black Lansing in that particular area. And I'm referencing the water crisis in a place like Michigan. That would have never happened before. That wouldn't be a conservative ideal. Yet liberalism and this idea of privatization, you privatize industries. Remember the example that I gave you before about Texas and the privatization of the infrastructure and utilities and water? The disaster that's happening in Texas right now, what the extreme right is saying, they're blaming solar panels for what's happening. No solar panels in a state like Texas. So those terms are constantly in flux. And right now they mean something different than what they mean in terms of a political philosophy and orientation. So we need to be aware of that, because I have literally had parents talk to me about, that they really dislike the liberal arts, but they wanted to send their kid to the best liberal arts college. And I said, what's wrong with the liberal arts? Well, you are all liberals. By the time they come home, they have these different hokey ideas. And it really is hard, especially for first-gen students, whether you're Black or brown or first-generation white at an institution. You go home and you feel yourself like a stranger in many respects, because the language and the vocabulary and the nuance that you begin to share, and I worry in particular about first-gen students who aren't called authentic when they go home. They're seen as sellouts because of the particular way that they begin to think about the world. So liberalism is a philosophy about freedom from dogma and enslavement. And conservatism is a political philosophy about unregulated state and tax practices, among many other things that I can't encapsulate at this moment. But thank you for that, Sean. That's what I meant by putting those terms into question, and why Brittany's question was so important too. We need the vocabulary. We need the vocabulary to be able to have these conversations with people who are coming into cultural consciousness, concientización, as we say in the Latin American tradition. And that consciousness requires a deep responsibility on the hands of young intellectuals such as yourselves to perfect democratic practice and inform people that liberal arts doesn't mean you're a flaming liberal. It means freedom from dogma, and education is the means to achieve that freedom. So thank you all.
Thank you, Lázaro, for answering so patiently and so thoroughly all our questions. I think Professor San Pedro would like to say a few final words.
Well, I just wanted to give our collective thanks to Lázaro Lima for joining us today on campus and for coming to Hofstra to present his book. I will ask for a round of applause to everyone. Thanks to our colleague, Professor Zilkia Janer from the Department of Global Studies and Geography for engaging in the conversation, and to our colleague, Brenda Elsie, the co-director of the Latin American Caribbean Studies program. And of course, thanks to all of our students and faculty that are also a part of this conversation. And I don't want to forget, thanks to Kathleen Collins, the moderator of the session, the director of the Hofstra Cultural Center, and the one who helped us put together this event. Kathleen was reminding us that actually Justice Sonia Sotomayor was at the Hofstra campus for a public lecture on October 2017. And we all know that we also have a dedicated wall to Sonia Sotomayor on the second floor of Breslin Hall. So thank you, everyone. Good night. And I hope we continue to read this great book by Lázaro Lima. Thank you, Lázaro.
Thank you. And stay brilliant. Your students are phenomenal. I hope to hear from you. Feel free to email. Take care.